G'day guys, timer is on, happy running. So today we're going to take a bit of a break from the episodes about recovery. I will get back to them, so we'll be talking about the impact of stress management as well as active and passive approaches to recovery. Definitely get back to them soon, but I thought it'd be a good time to jump in and talk about some running specific injuries again, as Achilles Tendinopathy, which I'm talking about today, which you might have heard of as tendinitis before, is one of the most frustrating and common injuries for runners to get, particularly as you start to increase your running from what you're used to doing. So these are quite different injuries from something like rolling an ankle, where you're tearing a ligament or doing a muscle tear, or maybe a joint injury. These tendon injuries are really tricky. They're a bit different, as you can generally run through them, and when it comes to getting them better, might be quite surprising, but one of the worst things you can do is rest, as that will just make it worse and last for longer. And one of the other worst things you can do is exercise. So it's a tricky one where you've got to find this sweet spot in the middle. Now, when I say one of the worst things you can do with exercise, that's not entirely true, because exercise is what we need to be doing. But again, it's just a matter of getting that dosage right. But these can really linger if you just totally ignore them. They can get worse and worse if you ignore them and just try and follow your plan with running, regardless of how this injury is forming. So just to wind back to the beginning. So when I was saying there's a few different names for this, tendinitis has been probably the more common thing that people would have heard of before. Something that you can get in basically any tendon in your body, but the most common ones are typically the Achilles, your patella, so in your knee. People do get those in the lateral hip, so this would be called like the greater trochanter, which is basically on that outside of your hip. Or another common place to get it is in the elbows and the shoulder. So what this is basically you have tendons are what attaches your muscles to a bone. So whenever you're contracting your muscle doesn't just directly attach to the bone, it goes via this tendon. So muscles are going to be muscles basically have contractile fibers. So with a muscle, you've got these overlapping layers of fibers. And if you can see the video, if you're on the STEPN Injury Prevention STEPN Injury Prevention Facebook group, you'd be able to see I basically have my fingers kind of overlapping each other. And in between each of my fingers, which would be the muscle fibers in this example, you have these little kind of feet claws that basically walk up and down to mean that you're contracting muscle. So those claws are pulling the little the fibers together, or they're relaxing and letting the fibers stretch apart. So that contractile element is what makes a muscle. But then when it turns into a tendon, you basically lose that contractile part of the structure, and it's made up much more of non-contractile fibers. So collagen fibers being one of the most common. So basically what happens with these type of fibers is they are excellent for energy storage and release. And so what that means is basically acting like a spring. So these spring-like fibers are a great way of building efficiency into the system, because instead of having to use extra muscular effort to produce force, you get this little bonus boost from the way that this elastic-like tissue works. So this is very particularly relevant for your Achilles, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. This happens a little bit less through some of the other ones like the elbow and the shoulder, but we can talk about that another time if it's relevant. But for the Achilles, then it's this spring-like mechanism that builds in a lot of efficiency into your running, and you just got to remember that your body is a very efficient and stingy thing, where it's going to use the path of least resistance and trying to maximize its efficiency by not using muscle if it can. So when you're running on your toes and really using, particularly when you're running on your toes, you're really loading up that Achilles. So I've got a mosquito flying around me. If you can see me, just a bit distracted trying to get it before it gets me. So basically when you're running, more on your toes, more on your calves, then that's putting a whole lot of load through the Achilles. And as we've talked about with other structures so far, you've got a certain capacity for each of your tissues that it can handle in terms of load. And once you exceed that capacity, if you exceed it a little bit and then give it adequate recovery, then you'll build up strength and you'll get stronger and adapt to that load. But if we go over that threshold and into like another threshold where it starts to cause damage to the structure, a specific amount of damage, because again, damage is what stimulates growth. But if we go too far, it starts this cascade, which is then known as tendinopathy. And so what happens is basically when you've got these nicely aligning collagen fibers that are acting like a spring, when that starts to get disrupted, just imagine a scab. So if you fall over, graze your knee, and your skin starts to try and repair itself by putting down a scab. So this is a whole bunch of kind of non-organized fibers. So these, the scab is basically like your body's throwing all of these cells to try and patch up the area, and then over time underneath, new skin is formed. And sometimes that new skin is formed where you can't even tell that it's different from the skin that was there originally, whereas other times you sort of see this scarring where the cells kind of haven't lined up quite as nicely as they were originally. So this is a way of thinking about tendinopathy, because when you do get this, when you've exceeded the capacity of your tendons to handle load, your body starts to go into this process of basically trying to send new fibers there to patch up the area. And then what happens is they start to align in a way that is not ideal. So instead of having these nice inline spring-like fibers, they start to kind of go a bit patchwork, a bit crisscross, which then makes the spring less efficient. And that's, an appropriate thing for the body to do to try and heal quickly. But then what happens is if you then start to get pain and you're like, oh, I better have a rest, and you don't give yourself any loading stimulus of the Achilles, or you really start to underload what you're used to doing, then the fibers don't have the signaling, they don't have the stimulus to align in a nice, neat, spring-like sort of way. So that means you kind of maintain this like disorganized cell structure, and that becomes less efficient at taking load in the future. And then when you start to try and run again, you've got this sort of slightly weaker structure that is then likely to signal more what is then turned into pain. So on the other hand, is if you totally ignore the pain and you just run through it and run through it and run through it, then you're basically exceeding your capacity again and again and again. And then you're not giving your body the recovery and the chance to align these fibers, and you're basically just re-aggravating it again and again. So all of this is very structural, and that might sound like, fast forward in the future, you scan your Achilles and you see that, hey, there's signs of a tendinopathy there, where there might be a disruption of fibers, or even like there's a it can often look like a donut hole on a scan. So you see that there's like a lack of these fibers, and there's basically a thickening around that hole where the fibers used to be. And you might think, oh no, this is now a weak tendon that's likely to cause a lot of pain. But it's really important, and I'm going to do a whole episode, or maybe even a few, on how morphology, so basically how structure of that you might see on a scan, doesn't equal pain or dysfunction. So if you look at a lot of the top athletes in the world who are performing at their best, they're quite likely to have these sort of structural changes, but they'll have that won't necessarily mean that they'll have any decrease in function or increase in pain. So there's not a one-to-one link in the amount of damage to the amount of pain that you experience. And where you've got that donut hole like thing, you've actually got all this extra tissue that's coming around that hole, and now that tendon is no more likely to rupture, and it's just as good at producing force than one that might look pristine. So that's just a really important note to realize here when I am focusing on structure. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you have a structural change that you'll have changes to function or pain. So the time is rapidly approaching 10 minutes, but the basic takeaway with this is if you do have this Achilles pain, so that's that tendon that goes down into your from your calf into your heel, you really want to be looking at how you can basically build up that capacity of the tendon in a really structured way, and that's going to be by using a combination of strengthening. There's the timer, that's 10 minutes. So I hope you had a great run for all of you people like me on only 2 energy still. So yeah, it's going to be a combination of trying to build up strength through doing things like calf raises, and then trying to build up its tolerance and capacity for energy storage and release. So that's going to be building up tolerance to hopping, skipping, and then eventually running. Now, I hear you say, does this mean I can't run? And that's not necessarily the case. It's going to be a case-by-case basis, so please don't take this as specific advice for you. If you do have this, please consider working with a professional. Remember, I can be consulted online. If you do have any, if you would like to do that, head over to the STEPN Injury Prevention Facebook group and get in contact. But with this, it is a, basically you need to start looking at how you can build up that capacity without overly aggravating it. So with tendinopathies, it is appropriate to train with some amount of pain, because we need to be doing enough stimulus to basically get a response from the tissue. But the feedback you get, where you find out if you've done too much, is then your baseline pain the next day. So if you wake up and usually your first few steps are really uncomfortable, they're like, you've got this sort of, 3 or 4 out of 10 pain every morning when you wake up and you start walking, which I'm sure a few of you who've started STEPN will have, then that's kind of your baseline pain. And then if you do a series of exercises, so it might be calf raises and skipping and running, and then the next day your pain's 5 or 6 out of 10, then you've probably done a bit too much the day before and you want to bring it back a little bit. However, if you're doing if you're doing those same exercises and then you're staying at your baseline pain or you're getting less, then that's probably a sign that you've done the right amount, and that gradually over time you'll build up that strength and tolerance to the point where you'll no longer have this pain. But warning, it's really hard. It is really hard because, again, this injury doesn't stop you, so it's so tempting just to do more than you're probably ready for, and it can really linger for a long time. So yeah, I will finish up there because I don't want this episode to go on forever, but tendinopathies are a real passion point of mine. I find them such fascinating injuries, and I've had plenty of experience both with my patients and myself with these. So if you would like to know more about this, if it does sound like you, and it might be the case that you have this under your foot, like that plantar fascia or plantar heel pain acts in a very similar way to this Achilles issue. And again, as I said, the knees and lateral hips are really common for this as well. If you do have particular interest in this, let me know and I can dive deeper into it and talk about more protocols of getting on top of this. But yeah, the main takeaway is rest is bad, too much exercise is bad. You got to get the dosage right, and then you need to really support that dosage with recovery, as I've talked about in the previous few episodes. So I will get back to the recovery stuff soon, but I thought it'd be a great chance to mix it up a little bit and talk about one of the most common running injuries. Hopefully, there's also some other things you can do to basically modulate how much you're using your Achilles. So the types of shoe, which I've talked about in a previous episode, will change how you're loading your Achilles versus through the rest of your body. So it might be worth going back to that episode, which I think was episode 4, which, looking at the analytics, is my least popular episode, which sort of surprised me because I thought shoes would be one of the most interesting thing for all us NFT shoe owners. Anyway, I will finish up there because this one is going a bit longer, but hopefully that was helpful. And if you do have any questions or topics that you'd like me to talk about some more, or if you just have any feedback, like, I don't know, there's words I say too often, or there's certain sounds like the Australian birds in the background that's, I don't know, annoying or great, do let me know, because it's nice to get some feedback from you guys, as sometimes it feels like I'm talking into the void. But the best way to do that would be on the STEPN Injury Prevention Facebook group, where you can jump in and communicate that way. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a great day.